Theatre of Pain is a returning dungeon for Season 2 of The War Within. The dungeon starts with a 34-minute timer, so as long as you complete the dungeon within that time frame, you will upgrade your key. Before we take on the first boss, there are 4 mobs that we'll need to deal with. Battlefield Ritualist will spam cast Necrotic Bolt on random players. This cast deals heavy shadow damage and applies a hefty healing absorb, so kick this where possible, but you must save a kick for their Unholy Fervor cast. This will heal the target for 6% of their maximum health every time they deal damage, but note that this buff can be purged if it does go through. Unyielding contenders will buff themselves with Death Wish, increasing their damage dealt by 20%, so tanks should be very wary when this buff is active, but note that this buff can be soothed off by classes that can do so. Soothes become even more valuable in this first area because Raging Bloodhorns will channel a Raging Tantrum that deals massive party-wide damage for 4 seconds, and this cast can be stopped with a Soothe ASAP. If you don't have a Soothe, you will need to use defensives and healers will need to heal through the heavy damage. Note that these first mobs bar the Bloodhorn can be skipped with a Shroud or Mind Soothe at the start if you are comfortable playing the Bloodhorn on the boss with Bloodlust. Now we can take on the first boss, the Affront of Challengers. This is a 3-boss encounter that does not share health, so try and cleave them down evenly due to their final will buff. This buff increases the remaining contenders' damage by 10% and increases their energy gain. Sathel the Accursed will spam Necrotic Bolt on random players, again inflicting nasty shadow damage paired with a heal absorb to interrupt this cast where possible. He will also afflict random players with Withering Touch, dealing large ticking damage over 12 seconds that your healer will need to dispel. Upon reaching 100 energy, Sathel will cast Searing Death, pulsing heavy damage to all players within the targeted 3-yard radius, so make sure to spread while this is active and pop a defensive. Pace Around the Virulent will unleash a Decaying Breath frontal that all players need to dodge. This will one-shot any players caught inside it. And when Pace Around reaches 100 energy, he will spawn multiple noxious spore swirlies that players must avoid. These swirlies will leave spores all over the targeted location for 2.5 minutes, so try and bait these together and tanks should move the bosses slowly around the encounter to avoid standing in them. Desia the Decapitator will cast Mortal Strike on the tank, dealing enormous physical damage and placing a 50% healing reduction debuff on the tank for 5 seconds, so tanks you must use big defensives for this ability. Upon reaching 100 energy, Desia will cast Mighty Smash, dealing lethal party-wide nature damage and reducing everybody's movement speed by 30% for 10 seconds. Make sure to use the defensive every time this goes off. After defeating the challenges, you'll drop down into the theatre beneath and you'll be able to choose between your next 3 bosses. For the sake of this guide, we'll make our way to Xav the Unfallen. On the way to Xav, you'll encounter Shambling Arbalists that will spam cast Shoot on random players, dealing high upfront physical damage. If targeted by more than one, you'll want to use the defensive. They will also cast Jagged Quarrel at random players, dealing heavy physical damage and applying a nasty 8-second bleed. You need to use the defensive when targeted by this ability, but note that you can stop the cast with hard CC, though it will immediately recast. Ossified Conscripts don't do anything but hit the tank quite hard, so just be prepared here. And we'll now face multiple mini-bosses back to back. These mini-bosses are found dueling each other, and the mini-boss you fight will depend on when you activate their roleplay by walking close to them. Dokig the Brutalizer will cast Savage Flurry on the tank, inflicting very high physical damage over 4 seconds. Tanks you'll want to commit a big defensive for this cast. Dokig will also cast an AoE Whirlwind around him that all players must run out from because this will kill you. And finally, he will cast Earth Crasher, inflicting huge party-wide damage and covering the room in swirlies that everybody needs to dodge. If Nekthara the Mangler is activated instead, he will cast the same Whirlwind around him, so players must again just run out from under the mob. But Nekthara will also hurl multiple Whirling Blades on the ground over the course of the fight that players must steer clear of. These blades slowly move and will likely one-shot you if you do come into contact with them. Finally, this mini-boss will cast Interrupting Roar, dealing massive party-wide damage and interrupting any spell casting when the cast finishes, so make sure you're idle of casting. After taking on one of these two, we'll head down the stairs to another pair. If Perugia the Bloodthirsty is activated, she will target a random player's location with Bloodthirsty Charge, dealing high upfront physical damage to anyone caught, so all players should avoid this mechanic. You'll want to commit a defensive if targeted by Ricocheting Blade. This inflicts massive physical damage and leaves a horrible bleed for 6 seconds, but this blade will also ricochet to nearby players, so make sure to spread from your team if you're targeted. If Heathen the Breaker was triggered, he will cast Colossus Smash on the tank, dealing enormous upfront physical damage and causing the tank to take 50% increased physical damage for 10 seconds. You'll need to commit a big defensive for this ability. Much like Nekthara, Heathen will also cast an Interrupting Roar that will lock players out if they're caught casting, as well as dealing large AoE damage. And finally, Heathen will cast a frontal ground smash at a random player. All players will want to immediately run out from this or it will kill you. As we progress to the final mini-boss, we'll encounter an ancient captain surrounded by arbalists and conscripts we fought earlier. While this captain is active, he will increase the damage of all nearby mobs by 25%, while reducing their AoE damage taken by 75%. So for this reason, you'll want to nuke this captain down ASAP. He will also cast a Moralizing Shout, which must be interrupted or it will reduce all players' damage done by 50%. After killing this deadly pack, we'll face the last of the mini-bosses. Wreck the Hardened will also cast the Whirlwind we've already seen. All players will need to run out from this. But Wreck will also put up a Swift Strikes buff, increasing her attack speed by 50%, but also causing her auto attacks to strike 2 other players for 45% of the damage. Tanks need to use mitigation here to reduce the outgoing damage, but healers will need to be prepared to spot heal here, and your whole group should use defensives. This ability is no joke. Finally, Wreck will hit the tank with an unbalancing blow, dealing big upfront physical damage and reducing the tank's dodge, parry, and block by 100%, so tanks prepare with a defensive here. The final boss you may take on is Advent Nevermore. She will cast the same ricocheting blade we saw earlier, so use a defensive if targeted and spread from your team, but she will also cast Seismic Stomp, inflicting huge party-wide damage that you'll want to use defensives for in higher keys. Now we can engage Xav the Unfallen, the second boss we'll be taking on in this guide. He'll hit the tank with a brutal combo, inflicting increasingly big physical damage to the tank, so tanks will need to commit a defensive to this. Periodically, Xav will spawn an impressive banner, which instantly becomes your whole group's priority kill target. You need to take out this banner quickly, as while it's active, it increasingly reduces your party's movement speed, which can easily result in a wipe when Xav soon after follows up with a group-wide combo of abilities. Xav will leap to the middle, dealing massive party-wide damage to your group. Prepare with a defensive if possible, but the timing does need to be quick here. And upon reaching the middle, he will cast a chain of 3 random abilities. Crushing Slam will mark a frontal that all players must move away from, or you'll be one-shot. You'll also be one-shot if you stand in Xav's Massive Cleave, which marks half of the room, so you'll need to run through him to the safe side. And finally, he can cast a Deafening Crash, marking a swirly around him, dealing lethal damage and interrupting spellcasting upon completion. The main mechanic of this fight, however, is Blood and Glory. Xav will stun and chain 2 players and throw them down to the platform below where they have to duel to the death. You'll want to make this quick, but don't pop cooldowns here, as once the duel ends, the winner will deal 10% more damage for 15 seconds. So upon return, they'll want to pair this up with their offensive cooldowns to nuke down the boss. The loser, however, will be debuffed with a damage reduction for the same 15 seconds, so if you're coordinated, you can decide who wins the duel to nuke the boss faster. But be very wary when returning to the main platform, as Xav will probably be casting one of his Might of Maldraxxus abilities. Upon defeating Xav, we'll return to the middle hallway, and for this guide, we'll next make our way to Gorechop. Blighted Sludge Spewers will Leaping Thrash to random players, dealing large physical damage to all players within 4 yards, so make sure to lightly spread here to make cleaving them down more efficient. Players must interrupt their Withering Discharge cast. This inflicts huge damage to all players and afflicts them with Withering Blight, dealing horrible ticking damage, but also decreasing damage and healing done by 20%. You'll also need to interrupt their Decaying Filth cast. This deals large upfront plague damage and leaves Decaying Blight on the target, dealing ticking damage for 20 seconds and reducing their health by 5%. Finally, upon death, the Spew will leave a swirly on the ground, dealing huge plague damage to any player stood inside, so make sure to avoid these pools. Putrid Butchers will cast Devour Flesh on the tank, dealing massive upfront physical damage, but also healing the caster for 300% of the damage done. Tanks should use the defensive to prevent big healing, and if playing with a coordinated group, you can repeatedly stun this cast to prevent the heal going off. Diseased Horrors will cast Decaying Strike on the tank, dealing substantial physical damage and afflicting them with Decaying Blight, again leaving a 20-second dot that decreases the target's health by 5%. Horrors will also cast a Meat Shield channel that must be interrupted. This will shield the caster for 30 seconds, absorbing all damage. Rancid Gas Bags will cast a Vile Eruption Frontal that will also shoot out from their behind, so players will need to position themselves to the side of this mob when it goes off. They also have a Disease Cloud Aura that constantly pulses party-wide damage that the healer will need to keep on top of, but use a defensive if you get low when fighting this mob. Now we can take on the third boss of this guide, Gorechop. He will cast Hateful Strike on the tank, dealing crazy high physical damage, so tanks should prepare a defensive for this. Occasionally, Gorechop will cast Tenderizing Smash, pulling in all players to his location and smashing the ground around him, dealing huge physical damage to anybody struck and knocking them back. Players should immediately run out from the boss as soon as they get pulled in here. Straight after your group is pulled in, the hooks on the side of the room will begin to travel across the room at different times, so you need to make sure to dodge these hooks until all of them have crossed. Getting caught will stun you and leave a very nasty bleed, so if you don't die while getting hooked and stunned, then make sure to commit a big personal defensive. During the fight, the boss will also spawn adds that your group needs to passively cleave down. These adds will again cast Leaping Thrash, so stay loosely spread, and upon dying, they will also leave toxic pools on the ground that everyone must stay clear of. After defeating Gorechop, you'll jump on the hooks to lift you back up to the middle platform, and now we'll finally head to Kul'tharok. The boss will be pelting swirlies all over the first platform of her wing, so make sure to keep on your toes and dodge. On this platform, you'll also find shackled souls that will target random players with Bind Soul, channeling a damage over time on them as well as reducing movement speed by 60%. Players should kick this cast to prevent outgoing damage, but if you pull all of them to the end, you'll also need to use AoE stops. Next, you'll need to kill the Portal Guardian to proceed. This mob will channel a Soulstorm, dealing heavy party-wide ticking damage that you'll need to commit defensives to. This is particularly scary to the player he afflicts with Shadow Vulnerability, increasing the target's shadow damage taken by 30%, so players that can decurse should do so immediately. And upon killing the Guardian, you'll pick up the Strange Orb, and you can then choose which side you want to go down by placing the orb on either side. Bone Maguses will spam cast Grave Spike on random players. Interrupt this where possible as it does decent physical damage, but make sure you save a kick for their Bone Spear. This deals fatal upfront physical damage and leaves a nasty 4-second bleed. If this does go through, the player will likely die. These mages also start with a Bone Shield that absorbs damage, but note that this can be dispelled or purged. Maniacal Soulbinders must be interrupted on their Necrotic Bolt Volley. This deals lethal party-wide damage and also places a healing absorb on everybody struck, and this can easily end in a wipe if this cast does go off. Between this cast, they will spam Necrotic Bolt on random players, kick this where possible as it deals decent damage and leaves a healing absorb. Soulforged Bone Reavers will summon Bone Spikes at each player's location. All players must make sure to dodge these swirlies or they'll suffer huge shadow damage and likely be one-shot. And the Bone Reaver will also channel a Bone Storm, dealing huge damage to anybody within 8 yards of the mob, so make sure to run away during this cast. Nefarious Dark Speakers will cast Spirit Frost on the tank, dealing high upfront frost damage. Kick this ability where possible and use defensives here if needed. And the Dark Spear will also face a random player's direction and cast Death Winds. This fires out a frontal wind that inflicts big shadow damage, but more notably knocks players back that are struck by it, likely knocking you off the edge to your death, so make sure to dodge this. Finally, it will place a Curse of Desolation on a random player. This will drop swirlies under the player for the curse's duration that inflicts large shadow damage and fears the player for 1 second if they are struck. Classes that can decurse this should do so. Upon reaching Kul'tharok's platform, you can now interact with the last orb, which will link to the beginning platform, so if you do wipe and need to come back, you don't have to run through all of the other platforms. Kul'tharok will cast Death Spiral, spawning multiple orbs around the encounter that circle the boss while active. Players will need to dodge these Phantasm Balls to avoid suffering huge shadow damage. During the fight, Kul'tharok will cast Necrotic Bolt on random players, which must be interrupted. This deals large shadow damage to the targeted player. He will also cast Well of Darkness, attaching a swirly to 2 players that pulses damage to all players within 4 yards. So make sure to spread here and don't overlap with your team. Upon reaching 100 energy, the boss will then cast Draw Soul, marking all players with an arrow above their heads and spawning a clone of themselves once the cast finishes. These clones will slowly walk towards the boss, and upon reaching him, it will trigger a Soul Corruption, applying a party-wide heavy dot for 16 seconds that also stacks, likely wiping your team. As Kul'tharok is casting this ability, players will want to stack at the entrance of the encounter, and once the adds spawn, you'll want to immediately swap and nuke them down while using crowd control to prevent them from reaching the boss. Finally, tanks will need to deal with the boss's Necrotic Eruption. This deals big shadow damage to all players in front of the boss, so tanks should try and face this frontal away while everybody else dodges. Tanks may want to use a defensive for this cast. After defeating the 4th boss, we can now head back up top to the arena to take on Mordretha, the Endless Empress. She will cast a Reaping Scythe on the tank, dealing a combination of physical and shadow damage, so tanks should be prepared with a defensive. Periodically, she will face a random direction with Dark Devastation, shooting a frontal beam that rotates that players must dodge. Getting hit will hurt a lot and also push players back. After this, she will cast Grasping Rift, spawning a rift that pulls all players in for 6 seconds. If you do come into contact with the rift, you'll suffer large damage and be stunned for 6 seconds. During this time, all players will be marked with a Manifest Death Circle. This deals ticking damage, and upon expiration will spawn a Deathwalker for each player, which needs to be grouped up and killed ASAP. You'll also need to interrupt their Deathbolt cast that they cast on random players here. Finally, the boss will cast Echoes of Carnage upon reaching 50% health, and for the rest of the fight, Mordretha will pulse damage every 2 seconds, so healers will need to stay on top of this outgoing damage, and periodically the boss will spawn ghostly combatants that all players must dodge. But that's it for this boss, and that wraps up Theatre of Pain for Mythic Plus in Season 2. If you're interested in my nameplates, they are from my free plates profile which can be found inside my Discord. The link will be in the description. And if this guide did help you or a friend out, then please feel free to drop a like down below, subscribe to your boy for more dungeon guides, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.